The earth did not just exist, it groaned. Generations had passed since the first garden, and in their wake, the soil had turned sour under the weight of human malice. It moved like a wildfire through the valleys, jumping from village to village, leaving nothing but ash and bitter resentment. Greed became the only currency that mattered. Men looked at their neighbors and saw only targets. A merchant would strike a deal, then burn the contract before the ink was dry. A brother would turn his back on a brother for a handful of silver. The air in the marketplaces grew thick with the stench of deception and the sharp metallic tang of violence. Every heart had hardened, calcified by the constant, relentless pursuit of cruelty. There was no room left for mercy, and no space for truth. The sky seemed to press down, heavy and suffocating, as if the atmosphere itself were tired of witnessing the rot. Down in the dust, the cycle of betrayal repeated until the rhythm of life was nothing but a jagged, broken pulse. High above, the silence was absolute. The divine gaze fell upon the landscape, tracing the path of every lie and every act of bloodshed. The world had reached its breaking point, and the time for cleansing had arrived. Yet, in the center of this fractured landscape, one man moved to a different beat. Noah did not shout. He did not steal. He did not look for weakness in his neighbor to exploit. While the rest of the world sprinted toward ruin, Noah walked with a deliberate, quiet pace. He spent his days tending to the earth, his hands calloused from honest labor, his eyes fixed on a horizon that no one else seemed to notice. When the marketplace erupted in violence, he turned his head and kept his path. When the neighbors gathered to trade insults and sharpen blades, he stayed in his fields, focused on the simple, repetitive tasks of survival. His life was a steady, rhythmic pulse of integrity that stood in defiance. He did not lecture, and he did not condemn. He simply existed as a living contradiction to the malice that defined his age. In the quiet of the morning, before the sun had fully cleared the hills, he stood still, head bowed, listening to a voice that the world had drowned out. He was the only one who remained tethered to the source of life, a solitary figure holding his ground while the foundations of the earth began to tremble. The voice did not come from the wind or the sky, but from within the silence itself. It spoke of a coming end, a deluge that would strip the earth. Noah stood motionless as the vision unfolded. The instructions were precise, leaving no room for error or interpretation. He was to build a vessel of impossible scale, a windowless structure of gopher wood, sealed inside and out with pitch. The dimensions were laid out in his mind: 300 cubits in length, 50 in breadth, and 30 in height. It was a city of timber, a floating fortress designed to withstand the fury of the deep. Noah traced the lines in the dirt with his finger, calculating the sheer volume of wood required, the thousands of joints that would need to be hammered, and the months of labor that lay ahead. The magnitude of the task pressed against his chest. This was not a structure for a journey, but a sanctuary against the total erasure of the world. He stood up, wiped the dust from his palms, and turned toward the forest. The work had to begin before the first cloud appeared. The forest echoed with the rhythmic strike of iron against wood. Noah hauled massive beams from the valley floor to the construction site, his muscles burning with the relentless, repetitive strain. Each joint was measured, cut, and hammered into place with surgical precision. As the structure rose, so did the crowd. Neighbors gathered at the edge of the clearing, their laughter sharp and jagged against the steady thud of his mallet. They pointed at the massive, windowless hull sitting on the dry, parched earth, calling him a madman who had finally lost his grip on reality. Noah did not look up. He wiped the grit from his eyes and reached for the next plank. He even sought out his grandfather, Methuselah, pleading with him to see the truth of the coming storm, but the old man turned away, his face a mask of weary disbelief. The mockery grew louder, a constant, biting wind that threatened to erode his resolve. Yet, Noah remained anchored. He ignored the jeers, the insults. He drove the final peg into the beam, the vibration traveling up his arm, and turned to fetch more wood. The ship was his only reality. The horizon changed. The blue faded, replaced by a bruised, heavy purple that pressed down on the treetops. The air grew still, thick with a static charge that made the hair on Noah's arms stand up. He dropped his hammer. The time for labor had ended. From the dense brush, the first pair emerged, two lions, their heads low, moving with a strange, focused intent. Then came the birds, a low hum of wings, and the slow, heavy tread of cattle. They did not fight. They did not scatter. They walked in a steady, rhythmic line toward the massive, open maw of the ark. Noah stood at the threshold, counting them as they passed. The smell of damp hay and animal breath filled the hold. He watched the last pair of creatures step over the threshold, their hooves clicking against the wood. The clearing was empty now. The wind had died completely. Noah stepped back, and God himself closed the door. The door swung shut with a final, resonant thud. The latch clicked into place. Outside, the world held its breath. Inside, there was only silence. The silence shattered. A single drop hit the roof, then another, and then the sky opened. It was not rain. It was a wall of water that hammered against the ark with the force of a falling mountain. The sound was a continuous, deafening roar that swallowed all other noise. Beneath the vessel, the earth groaned. The ground split open with a violent, jagged crack, and the fountains of the deep erupted. Boiling, dark water surged upward, tearing through the soil and turning the landscape into a churning gray chaos. The ark shuddered. It lifted, tilted, and groaned as the timbers strained against the sudden, massive buoyancy. Noah braced himself against the wall as the floor bucked beneath his feet. Outside, the world vanished. Hills, trees, and the very ground he had walked upon were erased by the rising tide. The ark became a lone, rudderless shell, tossed high upon the crest of a wave that stretched to the horizon. It spun in the current, rising and falling with the rhythm of the infinite, angry sea. The initial violence of the ascent gave way to a relentless, rhythmic rocking. Inside the windowless hull, the air grew heavy, saturated with the pungent scent of damp hay, animal waste, and the collective breath of thousands. Noah moved through the darkness, his hands tracing the familiar, rough-hewn timber of the stalls. Every muscle in his body ached from the constant effort to remain upright as the vessel pitched and rolled against the unseen currents. His family worked in the shadows, their movements synchronized by the swaying of the floor. They hauled water, shoveled stalls, and distributed feed. The sound of the water was constant, a muffled, rhythmic pounding against the wood that never ceased. It was a heartbeat of destruction. Weeks bled into months. The darkness inside the ark became absolute, broken only by the dim, flickering light of a single torch. They did not speak of the world that was lost. They focused only on the next task, the next breath, and the relentless swaying tide. The relentless drumming against the hull finally ceased. The silence that followed was heavy, absolute, and terrifying. Noah climbed the ladder to the upper deck and pushed open the small, heavy hatch. A gust of stale, humid air rushed in, but there was no horizon, only a flat, gray expanse that stretched into infinity. He reached into a cage and released the raven. It vanished into the gray void, never to return. Days later, Noah tried again. He took a dove, cupped it in his calloused hands, and set it free. The bird fluttered upward, searching for a branch. Hours passed before it returned, wings drooping, and collapsed onto the floor of the ark. Noah waited 7 more days. He released it into the morning light. The sun began to dip, casting a pale, weak light across the surface. Then, a speck appeared. As the dove landed on the ledge, Noah reached out. Clutched in its beak was a single, vibrant olive leaf. The water had receded. The grinding sound was unmistakable. The massive hull shuddered, tilted, and finally held fast against the slopes of Ararat. The long, swaying drift had ended. Noah moved to the main door, his hands trembling as he worked the heavy wooden bolts. They were swollen from the damp, resisting his strength, but with a final guttural heave, the seal broke. The door groaned open, revealing a world stripped of its past. Noah stepped out, his boots sinking into thick, cooling mud. The air was sharp, clean, and devoid of the stale, animal-heavy scent. He looked out over the jagged peaks and the receding, glistening valleys. The silence here was not the silence of a grave, but the stillness of a world waiting to breathe again. He gathered stones, stacking them into a rough, sturdy altar on the damp earth. He knelt, his palms pressed against the cold rock. As the last clouds pulled away, a brilliant, multicolored arc ignited the horizon. It stretched from peak to peak. It was a promise written in color. Noah stood, watching the light fade into the mist, knowing the judgment had passed. The earth was silent, washed, and ready. He turned back to the ark, calling his family to step out into the light of a new beginning. The covenant was sealed. The cycle of destruction was broken, and the spark of life remained, ready to take root in the quiet, waiting soil of a world reborn,